Hi, and welcome to Understanding User Needs. My name is Kentaro Toyama, and I'll be the instructor for this course. This particular lecture is called Introduction to User Needs Assessment, and it will give you an overview of what exactly user needs are and how we are thinking about needs assessment. Now, before I tell you a little bit more about myself, I want to mention that I'm from Japan, where despite tendency towards refined aesthetic sensibility, we are also very happy to have things like this happen, where in front of a beautiful autumn scene, there might be a bunch of vending machines. Now, I mention vending machines because they're an interesting kind of product to think about with respect to user needs. So first of all, I should mention that in Japan, there are all kinds of vending machines. If you've never been there, you'll find that they have vending machines that they don't have in other countries, such as for beer, eggs, or even underwear. Now, what's interesting about vending machines is not so much the kinds of things you can buy in them, but what happens when users actually use them. So most of us who have any experience with vending machines have certainly memories of bad vending machine experiences. You might remember a time when the UX itself breaks down and provides you with an error message that doesn't let you proceed with whatever you're trying to purchase. You might remember times when actual items in the vending machine got stuck. And of course, there's always a tendency to want, in these cases, to rage against the machine, possibly tip it over. But in this course, we're going to talk about somewhat more subtle problems that people have with vending machines. So for example, when you're thinking about buying any kind of soda, what are the different kinds of questions that people might have? Do users ever want anything else with their soda? For example, might they want a cup? Maybe they want another snack. Maybe they even want a napkin with their soda. What about different methods of payment? So most machines these days take coins and some take credit cards, but possibly they should start accepting mobile payments. Or maybe even by using some kind of biometric authentication, you could have a line of credit where you could buy different kinds of products through the vending machine. And finally, what do users really want when a machine fails? Maybe you want to immediately speak to a customer service representative. Possibly you'd like to have a receipt of the item that you thought you bought but didn't receive. Or maybe you'd like to have a little video captured of the entire event so that when you make your case and try to ask for a refund, there's evidence of what exactly transpired. All of these are questions that are concerned with user needs and the kinds of questions that we'd like to get to the bottom of when we do a user needs assessment. Why do a user needs assessment? One question is to understand why people would want to actually use a product or service in the first place. Oftentimes, we assume that we know why people buy products, but in reality, we may not know their full line of motivations. A user needs assessment helps us to get to the bottom of that. Another question is how people actually use or don't use a product or service. Sometimes after you've designed a service a particular way, people find that they want to use it in a different purpose, in a different manner. All of these are, again, questions of needs assessments. You might also want to understand what people like or dislike about a product or service. That's certainly important to understand in order to improve the product or to find more customers. And finally, we can ask questions like what else people might want to expect from a product or service. All of these kinds of questions and similar ones are all questions that we would answer through a user needs assessment. Most of the time, it's useful to think of user needs assessments as happening right before you design or redesign a product. Of course, anytime you're interested in designing a new product, it's very useful to understand your potential customers, what they prefer, how they think about potential products in that area, and so on. But user needs assessments can also be used during a redesign of an existing product. Anytime you have questions such as, why would users want to use a service and what do they think about each time they use it? Why don't customers go beyond the homepage of a particular website? What frustrates users of a given product? How could you improve the client's experience? Again, these are the kinds of questions that if you have, you'd want to perform a user needs assessment. Another thing to understand is that in the phrase user needs assessment, the word needs suggests something really urgent, a strong desire. But historically, a needs assessment has been performed anytime people have wanted to understand the clients or the customers of a given product or service. In the 1960s, an educational technology researcher by the name of Roger Kaufman popularized needs assessments, and he applied them not only to educational contexts and to educational technology contexts, but also to understanding what people in a particular community might need in a public service project and in larger contexts as well. In user experience, needs usually means the user needs, wants, preferences, or even their quirks. It's often, of course, focused on a product or service, but One thing to think about is sometimes you can understand more about a user when you take a little bit of a step back and ask, what are their larger goals? What were they trying to achieve in using a given product? Of course, there are pros and cons about taking the broader view, and we'll go into more of that later in this course. As far as how we proceed with user needs assessments, this particular course focuses on a certain kind of qualitative research. We'll talk about how to conduct interviews with users or potential users, observations of users actually using a given product, and also a certain way of analyzing the content of interviews by using something we call affinity diagrams. Qualitative research is extremely good at uncovering ideas and concepts in depth, often across a broad range of different use cases, and it's also useful for generating hypotheses about what users really want and what they actually think about. Sometimes qualitative research is also used as a way to understand causal explanations from, let's say, surveys, where we might understand something about a given user population, but we don't know why they think that way. Qualitative research can be useful at understanding those kinds of issues. In this course, we will, however, not cover certain kinds of techniques that are used by other people in user needs assessments. Within qualitative research tradition, there are people who use work models, who construct personas of different categories of users, and who might conduct market research with focus groups and so forth. We'll also not use a variety of quantitative research methodologies that are sometimes used in user needs assessments as well, whether they're surveys and questionnaires, and analyzing logs of user usage statistics, or document analysis where you might actually look at specific documents associated with a given product. Finally, a little bit more about myself. I'm a computer scientist by training. I used to work at Microsoft Research, doing research in artificial intelligence and human-computer interaction. I also helped found Microsoft Research in India, where I worked on technology for socioeconomic development of the world's poor communities. Today, I'm a professor at the University of Michigan School of Information, where I teach SI 501, Contextual Inquiry. This is a course that focuses on user-centered design and actually teaches many of the techniques that you'll be learning in this course. Finally, I'm the author of a book called Geek Heresy, Rescuing Social Change from the Cult of Technology. This is a book that talks a little bit about my experience with user needs assessments in a variety of contexts, particularly with respect to technology. Anyway, I hope that you've gotten a better sense for what user needs assessments are, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you. Let's suppose that the general manager of a GPS device product comes to you and says, can you help us design the new version? Well, they might say that they have a lot of sales data, and they've also done a survey with users. And in some of their products, they've actually been able to collect usage statistics because these products are online. Well, they might tell you that this is the data that they have, and maybe you could use it for your research. Now, of course, this kind of data is useful as a way to understand overall trends about how users of the product use the product. Also, it tells you something about the existing product in particular. In particular, all of the things that the designers of the system and the data that's collected could anticipate, all of that will have been collected. On the other hand, this kind of quantitative data is not particularly useful as a way of really understanding in depth how users actually use the product or what the new possibilities are for the product. And so, as somebody who does a user needs assessment, you would actually say, actually, I prefer to try a different kind of methodology for devising new features for the product. Some of the questions that you'd be interested in answering are things like, how do users actually input a destination into the GPS device? Do they make multiple detours through different methodologies because they get stuck? Are they really frustrated at any phase? What are their emotional responses to the different user interfaces? Another question might be, are there users who are interested in learning how to navigate a particular route from point A to point B without the GPS device? And would it help to have some kind of quiz that the device actually administers? And then other users might tell you, well, we like having features for the shortest path or the quickest path to a destination. But really, when we go on these large trips where we need the GPS device, what we want is in some sense, the most fun trip. We want to be able to make a stop every hour and let the kids out and have some fun. So some path that actually finds parks along the way would be most useful. Now, these are the kinds of things where you couldn't necessarily anticipate the issues in advance, and therefore it's difficult to design a survey, let's say, or to collect data in advance that would tell you whether these are useful features. And this is where qualitative research comes in. So qualitative research, as I mentioned previously, is characterized by non-numerical data. This is exactly the opposite of quantitative research, in which you're dealing primarily with measurement. In qualitative research, you're interested in the rich details that users and other stakeholders of a particular product or service would be interested in. You're also interested in the larger context in which people use the service. You might be interested in the rooms in which they use it, in the car if it's a GPS device, and other contexts like that. And what qualitative research is really good for is in extracting the richness and detail of experiences that users have. Some of the strengths of qualitative research are that they give you very in-depth information. You can find out things that are very difficult to measure. They also cover a broad range, so you might be able to hear things that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were just administering a predetermined survey. Qualitative research also generates hypotheses about why people do things, and they might also point to causal explanations. Now, qualitative research is actually a very broad term for a large class of methodologies. They sometimes involve interviews, different kinds of observations. You might have heard of focus groups and so forth. And then there's also different kinds of data analysis methodologies that involve coding interview transcripts, doing various kinds of analysis on the content, and so on. In this particular course, we'll be focusing on interviews, semi-structured interviews in particular, and a certain kind of observation. We'll be watching users actually use the product and understanding how they use the product. Finally, we'll be doing something with something called affinity walls, where we'll take a combination of what's called thematic analysis and recursive abstraction as a way to understand the overall sense of the detailed data that we'll collect. Since I've mentioned some of the strengths of qualitative research, I should also tell you about some of the caveats. So qualitative research tends to be weak at exactly the things that quantitative research is good at. So for example, if you're interested in what proportion of users do a particular thing, or what percentage of users take certain kinds of actions, that wouldn't be a good kind of question to ask with qualitative research. Similarly, if you're interested in whether a particular feature would increase usage of that feature, again, that's something that qualitative research wouldn't necessarily be good at, although you might get hints about it. And then finally, if you're interested in very specific questions like, does feature V cause effect W? That's again a question that you'd like to reserve for other kinds of research, not necessarily those that are qualitative. Although again, qualitative research might provide you hints. Overall, the weaknesses of qualitative research is that they don't give you a very good sense for numbers, for proportions, for relative measurements between different kinds of phenomena. And so what you're really interested in with qualitative research is getting this rich detail and the rich kind of possibilities that a product or service provides, not in understanding the numerical quantities that are associated with it. One thing I will mention is that the qualitative research methodologies that we'll be teaching in this course are actually extremely useful in a wide range of research contexts. Anthropologists use methodologies like this. Sociologists use it as a way to understand how people interact. And at schools of information, they use it as a way to understand, say, how people use social media or how people use their smartphones. So it's a set of methodologies that are applicable very widely. And if you learn this, it's really foundational for all kinds of research. In this course, you're going to be doing a small user needs assessment. And in order to do that, you'll be conducting interviews, observations, and performing data analysis. For this to make sense, though, you're going to have to pick a single project that you're going to work on throughout the course. And so I'm going to give you some tips on how to choose that project. So the qualities of a good project for this course are that, first of all, it should be about an existing product or service. You want a product or service that is used by at least a few people that you know, and for which you might suspect that there's some kind of challenge for the user. I'd like you to enroll at least 2 interview participants who are users of the product or service and who are willing to be observed while they actually use the product. The other thing is that in order for this to be a meaningful exercise for you, I'd like it to be something that you are not already an expert in. So for example, it shouldn't be something that you use all the time yourself. It shouldn't be something that you might already be a product manager for. You'd like to pick a project in which the product or service is something that you're at least a little bit unfamiliar with. The other challenge for choosing a mini project is that it should have just the right kind of scope. You don't want it to be too large. You don't want it to be too small. It should be something that you expect to get reasonable insights in within the scope of about 2 hours of interviews with 2 different people. So to give you an example of some different kinds of projects, for example, you wouldn't want to choose a project to redo the user interface for, let's say, a jet airplane cockpit. Nor would you want to do something that is about, let's say, a toilet where users might not be too happy to have you observe them while you're using it. And of course, there are also plenty of products where the UI is really just too simple. You couldn't really expect to do an hour's worth of interviews with, let's say, a simple light switch. So these aren't really great projects for you to propose for your own mini project. So let me give you an example of some of the different things that you could use. Consider, for example, a grocery store layout. Grocery store chains spend a lot of time trying to figure out where to put different products, and sometimes they're interested in understanding how users actually respond to those layouts. Now, you could consider the layout of the entire store, where the dairy products are, where the fruit is, where the cereal is, and so on, but that's a pretty large project to undertake. Another thing you might consider is the layout of the strawberries, but that I would say is probably too small. Again, you couldn't probably do an hour of interview with somebody just asking about their experience with shopping for strawberries. However, a reasonable size project would be to consider the layout of just the fruit section. There might be something about where they put the fruit in different ways, how do they arrange the organic fruit versus the fruit that's grown in a regular way, and trying to understand the differences to how users respond to that and what else they might be seeking in the fruit section is something that you probably could do with 2 hours of interview. So the whole store is probably too big. Just looking at the strawberries is too small. And just right is considering something about the fruit section and the layout of the fruit in that section. Let's take another example. This one is a little bit more involved with technology. So Amazon's website presents a significant UI challenge. You could imagine that users have all kinds of needs when perusing Amazon's website, and they go through a lot of different kinds of steps in actually purchasing a single product. Again, the experience of the entire website is probably too big. The experience of one-click checkout is probably a little bit too small. After all, there's not that much more than clicking on that one button. However, you might want to consider the checkout process for Amazon because it presents a reasonable number of steps. You can, again, imagine interviewing users for about an hour and understanding exactly what it is that they would want out of the process, what else they're seeking, and maybe the points of frustration. So this is a good size project for this course in doing a user needs assessment. To summarize what we've covered in Module 1, you've seen an introduction to user needs assessment, gotten an overview of qualitative research, and hopefully you have a sense for the kind of project you want to choose to work on for this course. In upcoming videos, we'll talk about how to develop an interview protocol, how to conduct interviews, and ultimately how to do the qualitative analysis of the interviews that you do conduct. In this video, we'll be talking about how to conduct interviews for user needs assessment, and specifically a certain kind of interview called the semi-structured interview. Now, there are many different kinds of interviews. You can do interviews in groups, as in a focus group, or with individuals. You can do interviews remotely over the phone, or possibly over video teleconferencing. And you can also do interviews, of course, in person. And then there are different kinds of interviews. There are structured interviews, which are really surveys or questionnaires. There are semi-structured interviews, which we'll talk about more in a second. And there are unstructured interviews. These are interviews in which there's almost no structure to the interview and you have a free-form conversation. So what we'll be doing is actually focusing particularly on in-person interviews that you conduct with individuals in a semi-structured way. Semi-structured interviews means that you're balancing what you already know about the situation, about the product or service, with an open, free-form discussion so that you're able to hear things that you might not be able to anticipate. In fact, that is exactly the point of a user needs assessment, is to hear things that you haven't already anticipated. Most semi-structured interviews involve some kind of script or what's called an interview protocol, where you have a list of questions that you use as a guideline for the interview, even though you won't actually follow them strictly. What you want to do is encourage a conversational style between you, the interviewer, and the person who's being interviewed. And because it's meant to be free form, you should expect to go off script very often. The kinds of things you should think about when you're conducting semi-structured interviews for needs assessment is, first of all, who will you interview? This is something that you've already thought about, but you want people who are users or potential users of a product or service. You also want to choose people who might be considered typical members of the group that you're interested in. So you don't want people who are extreme users, maybe just a small proportion of the overall user base, unless that's what you're especially interested in designing for. You also want to conduct the interview in a location where people feel comfortable and where they normally use that product or service. And similarly, in terms of the time, you want to choose a time that's convenient for the person who's being interviewed, and again, in a time when they would normally use that product or service. In the next couple of videos, we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly goes into an interview protocol, as well as how to design an interview protocol so that when you actually give the interview, you're most likely to get the responses that you like. User needs assessments can be conducted for a wide range of products and services. One example that you might think about is how to improve the situation at airport security. Now, anybody who's been through airport security has often found the process to be frustrating. The reality is it's already been reasonably well designed, but there are certainly many improvements that this kind of security line could have. Now, if you were going into this situation, you'd want to interview probably the people who are the guards at the security, who conduct all of the security protocols, as well as all the customers who go through security, and possibly even the managers who oversee the security process. But you wouldn't want to do this without some kind of preparation. And the preparation is in understanding what kind of questions you'd ask, what's the actual focus of your interviews, who do you want to interview, and what kind of different questions would you ask each of them. So this is where the interview protocol comes in. An interview protocol is basically a guideline for how to conduct an interview. You will have different components, and I personally stress that you always want to keep in mind a certain kind of overarching question that you're really trying to understand from the particular person that you're interviewing. Interview protocols will start with an introduction where you describe what's the point of the interview, as well as certain things that you respect about the interviewee. There will also be a section in which you have a list of questions that you want to go through, not necessarily in the exact order that you write out, but questions that will help guide you through the interview process. There will also be an observation section, especially for user needs assessment, where you'll want to observe how the user actually uses a product or might approach a product that they're not familiar with. And finally, there's a concluding section where you tell the interviewee what else you're going to do as follow-up and ask for any other additional responses that they might not have provided during the main interview itself. One last thing I'll mention is that you'll want to have a different set of protocols for each type of user or stakeholder that you'll be interviewing. So for example, in the context of airport screening, you'll have a different interview protocol for the people who are running the screening process, as well as for the customers, and possibly also for managers. Let me go over each of these sections one by one. One thing you want to do with every interview protocol is to have an overarching question in mind. This is the one big question that you're trying to answer and that you're hoping that through the interview you'll get a little bit more insight on. This is something that you might not necessarily ask the interviewee directly, but you want to keep it in mind throughout the interview in your own role as an interviewer so that you're always making sure that the questions that you ask are relevant to the overarching question. The introduction is really the section where you start the interview process. For most interview participants, you'll need to do a self-introduction of who you are, explain to them the goals of the interview and what you're there to discuss. Talk a little bit about the duration. You might let them know that the interview is going to take about an hour. And then also overview the different components of the interview. And then finally, you want to talk about some things that have to do with interviewing ethics, such as the fact that you'll maintain their confidentiality or not if the process requires that you not do that. And also, you want to make sure that interviewees understand that their participation is voluntary and that they might be able to quit at any point. Finally, you want to get permissions if this is necessary. In some cases, you'll want to ask for their release so that you can use the information that they provide. And also, in some cases, you might want to do an audio recording, which is also very helpful. And you need to get special permission to do that because, at least in many countries, it is against the law to do audio recordings without explicit permission. Next, we go to the main interview. And this is really the body of the interview protocol. You want to have basically a series of questions, not all of which you will ask in sequence, but which will help guide the interview and basically provide a way in which you can think about how to go through the different components of the interview itself. It's useful to start with kind of baseline or warm-up questions that are often short and simple. This helps gain momentum in the interview itself. It'll help the interviewee relax, especially if they're questions that they can easily answer. And then you'll get to the core questions, which are really the questions that you want to ask. These should always be in some way, shape, or form relevant to the overarching question. They'll often be open-ended, which means that they encourage longer responses. And you'll want to try to find a way to generate a conversational tone in the interview itself. This is a very tricky process, and so there will be more details in the next video. Observation is that part of the interview in which you're actually going to be observing your interviewee as they go about either using a product or service. We like to use something that is called a think aloud protocol, in which participants actually verbally express what they're thinking or doing as they go about using the product or service. This seems a little bit awkward, but it gets easier as time goes on. Now, you also want to have a series of questions that you might want to ask during observation. These are questions such as requests to perform certain tasks, questions that you might be able to anticipate about what kind of challenges they might face during those tasks. And again, you want to focus on the overarching question. What is it that you really want to understand from the user as they use the product or service? Finally, your interview protocol should have a conclusion section. This is relatively straightforward. You'll ask a few questions about whether they have anything else to add that wasn't covered in any of the questions that you asked. You definitely want to thank them. You also want to let them know about any follow-up plans. Usually it is a courtesy to be able to suggest that if you have any other questions that you'll contact them, and also that you'll report back with the overall results of the study that you're conducting. You want to provide your contact information, ask again if they have any questions, and finally thank them one last time. One thing I'll mention about interview protocols is that there's really no hard rules to how you conduct an interview or even how you design the interview protocol itself. So the kinds of comments that I'll be making in the next video and what you've already heard in this video are really just guidelines. The most important thing is to, first of all, ensure that you're not doing anything with interviewees that they wouldn't want for themselves. That means if they really want to keep their identity confidential, that you should definitely respect that. If at any point they want to stop the interview for whatever reason, you should also respect that as well. After the interview ethics issues, the most important thing, of course, is that you have the questions that you want answered. Have you gotten the responses that you want with respect to your overarching question? And if not, what else do you really need to know? These are things to keep in mind throughout the interview process. Now, there are different variations to interview protocols. You might have multiple overarching questions. In some cases, you might interleave the raw interviews with observations. In some cases, you might have no observations at all. And that especially happens if there's no product or service yet that you're actually investigating and you're considering whether an interesting new product or service might be worthwhile. The other possibility is to do in-situ observation, where you actually go to the site where people are using a product or service and watch how people use the product or service without actually asking them to do a think aloud process. In any case, interview protocols are potentially quite complicated, and so in the next video, I'll provide some tips on how to design them. In the 1970s, there was a television series called Columbo. This was about a detective played by Peter Falk, and the detective was famous for being a little bit rumpled. He wore an overcoat no matter what the weather was, and he was very absent-minded. But he was also an incredibly shrewd detective. And one of the things about the show was that almost more than half of every show was basically him interviewing what was likely to be the murder suspect in each episode, and eventually getting to a point where he was able to extract the information he needed from the suspect to the point where he could actually find enough evidence to convict the person. Now, what's interesting about Columbo was that almost in every episode, there was a point at which he seemed to be over with the interview, and then he would say, oh, by the way, just one more thing, and he would ask some critical question that really caused the entire thing to unravel for the murder suspect. What's interesting about Columbo is not so much that we would necessarily want to imitate his style, but he was very good at combining the science of interviewing with the art of interviewing. He did a lot of preparation for each of his interviews, and he did all of the background things that detectives need to do to make sure that they have the evidence that they need. But at the same time, he was very skilled at establishing rapport with the person who he was interviewing, and basically finding out different ways in which the interviewee would give up important information. So that's exactly the kind of thing that we'd like to do also in our user needs assessments. Now, interviewing is actually both a science and an art. On the one hand, there's a science of actually understanding how to put together an interview protocol, how to ask certain kinds of questions, but it also requires a certain amount of improvisation during the interviewing process itself. In this video, we'll be focusing primarily on the science of the interview protocol. In a later video, we'll talk about how to actually adjust and to improvise during the interview itself. One of the things that you want to think about is what kind of questions you want to ask. And perhaps the biggest issue in semi-structured interviews is to make sure that you're asking open-ended questions as opposed to closed-ended ones. So open-ended questions are those where you leave enough room for the interview participant to provide a lot of interesting detail. You want to ask how and why questions. Why did you do a certain thing? How did you do a certain thing? Instead of yes and no questions like, do you like certain feature X? Similarly, you can ask things like, how did you go about doing this the previous time you engaged with a product? As opposed to how many times a week do you do a certain activity? Because that's, again, a question in which you'll have a very short answer. You can also ask, can you tell me about a specific instance? And that's, again, different from what is your favorite color, for example, where, again, the answer is going to be very short. So throughout, the idea with open-ended questions is to ask questions in which you really engage the interview participant in a way that they feel compelled to tell you as much as they might feel about a particular product or service. So one thing you'll notice is at the top of this slide, I've labeled open-ended questions to be good questions and closed-ended questions to be not so good questions. And that's because closed-ended questions aren't necessarily bad. There will certainly be times when you want to ask closed-ended questions and get at short answers. But for the most part, you want to ask open-ended questions that encourage the interview participant to reveal more detail and that allow them to tell a little bit more of a story about their interaction with a product or service. Another thing about the questions that you'll want to put in your interview protocol are that you want to get at specific and concrete information as opposed to abstracted and generalized information. Now, this might not make immediate sense. After all, eventually what you want to do is come up with abstracted and generalized knowledge that you can use as a way to design future products or services. However, your job as the researcher is actually to do this abstraction and generalization from the more concrete and specific information that interview participants give you. And so during the interview, what you really want to do is focus on as much concrete, specific information as you can. One way to do this is to ask questions about a specific instance when the interview participant has used a product or service. So you can ask questions like, tell me about the last time that you did X. Or can you think of a specific instance when you did this, and can you tell us more about that? You want to avoid questions where you necessarily ask them, what do you normally do when, or what is the typical way in which you do something? Because what this does is it causes the interview participant to generalize from their experience. And sometimes people are not very good at generalizing accurately. Again, the generalization is your job as a researcher. And so what you really want to do is start with the concrete, specific information. Now, sometimes it's useful to ask the generalized question towards the end of a section of the interview, because people do often have ideas about why they do certain things and why they tend to do them on a regular basis. But again, you want to make sure that you're also covering the specific and the concrete as well. Again, the question is not between good and bad questions, but questions which are good, as well as questions which you might allow yourself to ask, but which you'd like to suppress in favor of spending more time on the more concrete and specific questions. A third issue with questions in an interview protocol is to try to think of ways in which you can ask questions that are not leading and which are not judgmental. So what do I mean by this? Non-leading questions are questions where you don't express any kind of opinion about whether the different ways in which the interview participant might answer are good or bad. You might ask, what option do you prefer, as opposed to saying, do you prefer X over Y? Because that suggests maybe that you're expecting them to prefer X over Y. You also might want to ask, what do you think was the reason for a certain kind of behavior? As opposed to, was it because of a bad process that the task was difficult? The second question actually seems to suggest that the task itself was difficult and there was something wrong with it. And so you're encouraging people to think something that they may not necessarily believe without that prompting. Another category is, how did you try to address a particular problem? As opposed to, why didn't you use feature Z? The problem with this second question, again, is that it's a little bit judgmental. It's suggesting maybe that the interview participant should have known that they should have used that feature, and that can sometimes make them defensive, which is not what you want during the interview process. To the extent possible, you want people to feel extremely open and free and to connect with you in such a way that they can tell you things that they might not otherwise tell other people. The other thing you want to think about in an interview protocol is the overall organization and flow of questions. Now, for a 1-hour interview, I would suggest that you want to prepare something between, about 6 or 10 questions. If they're good open-ended questions, you'll find that even 10 questions is a lot. And then what you want to do is think about how those questions are organized. You'll want to put questions that are about similar themes together so that it allows the interview participant to maintain their stream of thought. And then within each clustered theme, you want to organize them so that they make some kind of sense. Maybe the questions are arranged in some chronological order with respect to a process. They might have a larger narrative in mind, or they might go from, let's say, broad questions to narrow questions, or vice versa. Similarly, you'll want to take the existing clusters and organize them in some way that makes sense. Again, you could organize them in chronological narrative or other ways. One thing that I recommend is also saving any kind of sensitive questions or questions where you anticipate that the interview participant might become a little bit uncomfortable towards the end so that you can maintain the momentum of the interview, and by the time you get to those sensitive questions, the interview participant is accustomed to giving you answers that are interesting to you. Once you have the core questions, you'll want to add follow-up questions to each of them. It's useful if you kind of organize these with bulleted lists where the follow-up questions occur underneath each core question. You can ask different kinds of follow-up questions where you're asking for more detail as well as prompts for specific information. Sometimes you can anticipate that users have challenges with certain aspects of a product or service, but they may not necessarily mention them the first time they answer one of your open-ended questions. If that happens, you'll want to make sure that you have follow-up questions where you specifically ask about the feature X or about service Y so that you can make sure that you're still getting all of the information you need for your overarching question. Sometimes it also helps if you repeat certain questions. So for example, if a person tells you about one instance when they use a product, you might say, well, can you tell me about another instance, maybe the time immediately before that, and so on. So these are the kinds of follow-up questions you'll want to ask. It's really useful if you think through the kind of responses that you might get to one of your core questions, and then design your follow-up questions to be in response to those kinds of answers. It's useful also for your follow-up questions to be ordered in a certain kind of way. And again, you'll probably not ask all of the follow-up questions that you list, but having them there is very helpful during the interview itself. Some final thoughts about the interview protocol. Again, remember that the goal of the protocol is for you to prepare and for you to have a good sense of what the interview is going to be about. Writing out the questions is very useful because during the interview itself, you'll have to think about a large number of things and you'll need to improvise. And just like with playing music, if you've memorized the basic fundamentals, then it's much easier to improvise later on. So one thing I recommend is for you to memorize the overall flow of the protocol. You don't have to memorize the wording of every question, but you do want to make sure that you understand what questions are there. An ideal interview takes place in such a way that you don't even have to refer to your protocol during the interview itself because you understand the protocol so well. And again, let me remind you that you will not be asking all of the questions in the protocol one after the other. That's more like a survey. And again, what we're trying to get at is a conversational style during the interview process itself so that your interview participants feel comfortable and relaxed and are open to providing the information that you're seeking. Finally, this video comes with some handouts that you'll want to take a look at for how to design interview protocols. It also contains templates for the parts of the interview protocol that are pretty standard, such as the introduction and the conclusion. You can, of course, edit them and revise them in a way that fits your tone and the way that you speak. Hi. So this will be a practice interview session. Normally your interviews might be anywhere from an hour or longer, but today we're going to do a short interview of about 10 to 15 minutes. As you can see, I have my interview protocol with me, and this is my guest, Jasmine Kaur. All right, so we'll begin. Hi, my name is Kentaro Toyama, and I'm here today to understand better how people use GPS devices, and particularly for navigating from one place to another. This interview will take about 10 to 15 minutes, during which time I'll ask you some questions. Throughout, I'd like you to treat me as if I'm somebody who doesn't normally use GPS. Just pretend like I don't know anything about the subject. A couple of things before we start. The first is that everything about this interview will be confidential. So even if we publish information that we use from this interview, it will not be linked in any way to your name or to anything that's personally identifiable to you. If we quote you in any documents, they will also not include your name. If there's anything you really don't want on the record, even despite that confidentiality, please let me know, and we'll make sure that it's not in any reports. And also, all of this interview is going to be entirely voluntary on your part. I don't expect that there will be any uncomfortable questions, but if there are any, you can let me know and we'll either exclude them, or if at any point you feel uncomfortable and want to exit the interview, please let me know, and we'll just cancel the entire process. Do you have any questions for me?
No, that sounds great.
All right, then let's proceed. So first off, just a few background questions. How often do you use GPS devices for navigating?
If I am in a new town, then almost every time I drive. And when I'm in town, my own town, then I would say like 50% of the time.
And how many times, let's say a week, would that be?
In a week, I drive every day, I would say 14 times a week.
14 times a week is how often you use a GPS device?
Yeah.
Okay. And in general, are you happy with GPS technologies?
I am.
So you think that they help you do what you need to do?
I think so, for the most part. There are moments which are frustrating, but overall they get me from point A to point B, so I'm really happy about that.
Great. So I want you to think back to your most recent time that you used a GPS device and tell me a little bit about that. So you can begin with where you were going.
Okay. So I just got back from California. So the last time I used was on a trip from San Francisco to San Ramon.
Oh, by the way, do you mind if I use a audio recorder at this point? This is just for my own purposes. It will just capture everything that you're saying so that I don't lose anything. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so the last time I used a GPS device was on a trip from San Francisco to San Ramon.
Great. And where exactly were you going from San Francisco to San Ramon?
So in San Francisco, Mission Bay, to San Ramon, my house.
Oh, I see. Okay. And this was, when you say your house, this obviously wasn't your house.
Yeah, my family.
Okay.
I was with my sister.
Great. And how long did the trip take?
Oh gosh, that day took at least 2 hours.
Oh, okay. So this was a pretty long trip.
Yeah.
And when exactly did you turn the GPS on?
Time-wise, I remember 5:30 p.m. and I was in the parking lot and keeping my fingers crossed that the signal would work, because it was, I think, at least a 5 or 6 storied parking lot. I was parked on the 5th floor. So I turned on the GPS device inside the car as well as on my phone.
Oh, okay, so that's really interesting. So you use 2 GPS devices?
Yes.
And why is that?
Hoping the one would start sooner than the other. And I've just had experiences, one in there, like one fails, then I can rely on the other one. Plus, the cell phone one is better in some ways, wherein it tells me what the fastest route is based on the current traffic flow. And that's really helpful. Whereas the car device is kind of my fallback option, just in case the cell phone hangs, I run out of battery, or there's some problem with the connectivity.
Okay, that's really interesting. And is this something that you do often, or is this unusual?
As long as my car has a GPS device, I do use 2.
You use both?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's interesting. And in this particular case, did you have to interact with the GPS once you set the destination? Or with either GPS device?
Oh, of course, all through the way, because 5:30 p.m. Bay Area traffic is pretty bad. So on the cell phone, I kept getting messages on, hey, if you take this other route, you'll save like 5 minutes or 15 minutes. So that's one kind of interaction. The second is that sometimes the cell phone says, like, take exit number XYZ, and on many exits, the exit number is not that visible. What's visible is the name of the road. So the car GPS gives the name, or the cell phone one will give the number. So one or the other works. So that's why I tend to look at the map on the car device and then say, okay, like, this is precisely the exit I should take. So.
Okay, so so it sounds like there's at least 2 different instances when you interact with the device, even while you're driving.
That's correct.
One is to let the GPS know whether they should take an alternate route or not.
That's correct.
And whenever it asks you that, do you ever actually take an alternate route?
I have learned through experience that if it's just 5 or 7 minutes, it's not worth it. And if it's like 15 minutes or 20 minutes, then I take the alternate route.
Okay, that's interesting. So it suggests maybe that you might even like the possibility of turning off those notifications unless it's a significant time savings.
I don't know about it. Though one frustrating moment I had was that I regretted not taking the alternate route. And there was an option of canceling, which actually I really dislike. There's no voice command that I can give. I have to look at my cell phone while driving, and then I have to say no, ignore. I don't even remember what the command is, but I have to say just stop bothering me with this alternate route. But I regretted not taking the alternate route, and there was no way to ask for that alternate route again.
I see. Yeah, so you would like better kind of voice enabled commands, not
Yes.
having to actually press
That's
buttons
correct.
or screens.
Yeah.
Great. And the second issue you had was that sometimes it's hard to tell which exit you're actually being asked to take because the names or the numbers are different from what you see on the road.
Yes, plus I'm so bad at estimating what 0.3 or 0.6 mile is. So I need some visual indicator and then which is helpful.
Okay, that's terrific. Did you have any other passengers on this particular trip?
No, I was driving.
So you were
by myself.
by yourself. So it
Yes.
wasn't possible for you to have, let's say, your passenger do some of the navigation for you, anything like that.
No, and
this
it
instance.
just doesn't work for me if somebody else is telling me what to do. It's an additional distraction.
Right, terrific. And then anything else on this trip that you remember, interactions with the GPS device, anything that it did that frustrated you or anything it didn't do that frustrated you?
It took me through this very crazy, I don't know if you're familiar with the Tilden Park area. It's like in the mountainous or hilly kind of a region, and I hate driving in the hills. They're like very narrow roads, so the GPS suggested that would be the fastest route, and I had no idea what that topography of that area was like. And once I was on it, I realized that, oh gosh, this is going to be pretty crazy drive for me. And there was no way now for me to say, can I exit this route and can you give me an alternate route? I was stuck on it for at least 13 miles.
Okay, that's very interesting. So it took you on a kind of curvy mountain route that you didn't like, and you couldn't exit,
Yes.
even if you wanted to.
That's correct.
Those are great. Anything else that might have happened on this trip that was unusual or that you didn't like?
No, I think that was about it.
And in this case, would you say that this was a typical kind of trip that you've been on with your GPS device, or is this unusual?
The mountain drive was pretty unusual. Other than that, pretty typical. It's always the same. I'm in the parking lot. I'm hoping that the GPS device would start one or the other because it takes some time to locate where you are, and that's time lost, and every minute lost means a long wait in the traffic. So that's always there. The directions around the exit sometimes are a little confusing. That's also there. So I think it was pretty typical, except for the crazy
Okay.
mountain drive.
Great. And you also mentioned that this was a 2-hour trip.
Yes.
Is that usual for you?
Not very usual, but in the Bay Area, it's more typical for
Okay.
me, where I'm there a month out of the year.
Great. Well, so that's a great example of a trip that I think is relatively unusual for you in that it was in a place that was not where you normally live. And there are several instances where you mentioned things like the detour through the mountains that were unusual. I'm actually interested in these kinds of unusual trips. Can you think of any other recent unusual trip that you've taken that you could tell me about?
Let me think. Yes. I went to this place close, again, from San Ramon to this place close to, before Santa Cruz. I believe it's called Boulder Creek or Bear Creek, Boulder Creek. And it was for a friend's daughter's birthday party. I've never been there before. And again, oh gosh, the fastest route, or probably it was the only route. I don't know what it was, but again, it was at least a 20-mile drive through the mountains. So, yeah, that was again a very atypical, not a very typical drive for me.
And did you use a GPS for this trip as well?
I did. I did. In fact, I was very frustrated about the mountain drive, having to go through it second time within a week, that I started shouting commands at Siri, please show me an alternate route, knowing that that wouldn't work.
And did Siri respond in this case?
Oh, Siri most often tells me that it doesn't understand what I'm saying.
Are there other instances when that you can think about where you've gotten some kind of unusual use of the GPS, whether it was unusual circumstances or a situation when the GPS device provided some unusual help?
Yes, I didn't know that the iPhone app that I use for navigation, that has this a feature where I can find what are the gas stations nearby and other things, like there were some 6 options. Once I accidentally clicked on the screen, I don't know in which form, whether it was a left or a right drag, a bottom to up, or I don't know what I did, it popped up. And that was really helpful. But I still don't know. If you just ask me today that can you make sure that it pops up, I am not sure that I'll be able to do it in the first go. I'll have to tinker with it a little bit. But that feature is pretty was a surprise for me.
Okay, so it sounds like you accidentally set off the feature that finds gasoline stations, and that was useful to you.
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Anything else that might be relevant?
Let me think. I think that's about it.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Those are all the questions I have for you. What we'll do after this is I'll get together with some of the other people who are conducting interviews, and we'll take all of this information, put it together. We'll compile a report for our purposes. If you're interested, we can send a copy of the report to you as well. But otherwise, if you have anything else you'd like to add, please contact me. You already have my email, and that would be great. Any questions?
That's it. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again. Okay, well, that was a sample interview, I think about 10 to 15 minutes in length. Normally, of course, you would go on for longer. There were lots of interesting issues that she brought up that I think could be followed up on. Things like, why did she use 2 devices and why does she use them all the time? Has she, in fact, experienced a situation where one or the other device failed? There were interesting questions around additional features like ways to use the GPS device, especially on the smartphone, without actually having to physically interact with it, maybe just through voice commands, as well as features that are difficult to discover but which are useful, such as how to find a feature where you can find the nearby gasoline stations. All of these are interesting user needs that could be explored and with further analysis could lead to recommendations. In this video, I'll be giving you some tips for the actual interviewing process. You might remember from previous videos that interviewing is both science and art, and much of the science is captured in the preparation for the interviewing itself. The interview protocols are something that once you've written out and are sure that they're good protocols, you'll want to try to memorize at least the overall flow of them so you won't have to constantly review them during the interview itself. But then the interviewing process itself is reasonably improvisational. Even though you have the interview protocol, you'll want to deviate from the script, follow up on interesting ideas that the interview participant might have expressed, and in general, try to maintain a conversational tone. And this is something that's reasonably challenging to do, especially if you've never done an interview before. Let me tell you a story about one of my experiences with interviewing. So this was in a part of South India, which was a rural area, and I was doing a project trying to understand how people in a particular village interacted with their digital devices and so forth. Surprisingly, even in very remote parts of the country, there are a lot of people who have mobile phones. Anyway, I was speaking to one woman, and despite the fact that I had an interpreter with me and we'd been trying to ask her a range of questions, most of her questions tended to be very short and abrupt, and she was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. I mean, of course, it's understandable. He was a complete stranger from not only another part of the country, but another part of the world, asking her all of these intrusive questions. Anyway, I was almost about to give up when I noticed that there was a child running around, and so I started asking her questions about her child. I said, "Oh, this is she's a really cute child. How old is she?" And so on. And very quickly, her tone and her overall attitude kind of changed. The mother became much more lively. She was obviously excited about talking about her child. And in the process, we established a little bit more rapport, and I felt that we could probably come back to the interview questions. And in fact, we were able to do so soon afterwards, and that was one of the better interviews I had for that set. So one thing to think about when you're doing interviews is, except in situations where both sides really understand what the interview is for. Also, sometimes in kind of corporate settings, people often understand that everybody wants to get right to business and not waste any time with small talk. But very often with regular users, people that you don't know very well, they'll expect that you'll want to get to know each other a little bit. So I really encourage people to start with a little bit of small talk. I'm personally not very good at small talk, so I always have to think about what I could possibly talk about. You can always try to find something in common with the other person. If you're in their place of work, you can look around the office and see if there's anything that you recognize, chit-chat about that. Of course, it always helps to compliment them about something that they seem to have taken care to do. If they dressed a particular way or if they have something nice on their desk, that's also something to talk about. And of course, you can always discuss the weather, which is really a universal, at least as I found in my experience. Now, the other thing that you want to do throughout the interview is to really adopt a learning mindset. Remember that you're there to learn as much as you can about this person and that they probably have something that you have no idea about. In fact, if they don't, it's not really clear why you need to interview anybody at all. So what you really want to do throughout the interview is to maintain this learning mindset, be really open. You want to think of them as the expert because after all, they are the expert in terms of their own experience, even if they're not an expert with the product or service that you're discussing. You want to observe, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open for anything that might be out of the ordinary, something that you might not expect. And of course, throughout the interview, you'll need to adapt. Again, the interview protocol is just a guideline for you. And what you really want to do is take that guideline and change it and improvise as the interview goes forward, focusing on the most interesting parts of the things that your interview participant says. Listening, of course, is another obvious thing to do, and yet I find that for many interviewers, this is the hardest part. After all, you have this entire protocol in mind, you're keeping your overarching question also in mind, so there's a whole lot of things you have to keep track of, and on top of that, you're trying to improvise. So it's sometimes really difficult to actually listen, but listening is the thing that causes your interview participant to want to talk. And let me just mention that it's really important to listen. And by the way, did I mention that it's really important to listen? One thing I'll say about listening is that when you do it well, you'll find that interview participants will often open up. Sometimes the experience for the interview participant is that for the first time, somebody's actually listening to their experience with a product or service that they might themselves have found a little bit frustrating to use. And so they will often be very open if they find an empathetic ear. Now let me talk about a completely different kind of story. So in the movie Star Wars, the first one, which was episode 4 released in the late 70s, Luke Skywalker, the hero, is in a spaceship and he is tasked with trying to shoot a torpedo down a hole in the Death Star, in the one point of weakness that the Death Star has. Now, because this is an advanced society, they have all kinds of computing technology, and he has this computer that would help him shoot the torpedo into the Death Star. But while he's in the flight, he starts hearing voices from his mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And basically, Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "Luke, let go. Don't use the computer. You don't need the computer. Use the Force." And Luke ultimately complies. And of course, we know how that ends. He was able to successfully shoot the torpedo into the Death Star, and the Death Star explodes. Now, what I want you to understand out of this story is that sometimes you have to let go of all of the preparation that you've done so that you can achieve the objective of conducting a good interview. Without doubt, advanced preparation pays off. So you definitely want to have a good protocol. You want to make sure that the questions that you're asking in the protocol are the right ones for answering the overarching question. But at the same time, you want to think of the protocol during the interview itself as kind of backup. Something that you don't really have to look up, but may have to in case you get stuck or in case you forget what other questions you might want to ask. And so what you really want to do during the interview is to keep asking follow-up questions based on what your interview participant says. If they say something interesting and unexpected, those are really the threads that you want to follow. And sometimes you'll find that a single topic is interesting enough that you might spend an entire hour discussing just that point because your interview participant has a lot to say about that particular issue. In any case, you want to make sure that you are maintaining a conversational tone again throughout the interview, and try not to look too much at your interview protocol. Again, if you've done the preparation well, you'll be able to let go and really try to maintain your attention on the interview participant and what they're saying. Finally, I find that a lot of this is very difficult to think through in a very logical, rational, conscious way. But if you try to maintain an attitude of curiosity, because after all, what you're really trying to understand is what is it that this user experiences with the product or service that might give rise to another new idea, a new feature, a new way of designing the product or service, and so on. And so you really want to be curious about their experience. Next, a word about note-taking. So during the interview, you'll definitely want to take notes. I personally encourage you to take notes on paper using pen or pencil. A lot of people these days are very comfortable taking notes on their laptops, and that's okay. But one of the things I find is for a lot of interview participants, the laptop screen ends up creating a little bit of a mental barrier, and it makes it a little bit harder to establish that rapport that you need with the interview participant. If you do take notes on paper, what you'll want to do is print out the interview protocol with a bunch of blank spaces between the different questions so that you can have plenty of space to take notes. Now, as far as note-taking goes, there's no one correct way to take notes, but some of the things that you might want to try are, first of all, to capture the key points that you hear throughout, although those are usually things you'll remember. So you really want to capture them in short phrases. Don't spend too much time on those kinds of notes. The other thing that you want to capture are things that audio recording absolutely could not capture. So different impressions that you might have, facial expressions of the interview participant, the physical context, and also you might think about writing notes about follow-up questions that were not in the protocol itself. One thing I tend to do after an interview session is to go through the notes immediately afterwards so that you can get a sense for what exactly happened in the interview, and you'll remember the parts where you deviated from the interview protocol. Note-taking is sufficiently important that I strongly recommend you do it, even if you do have an audio recording as backup. And again, there's no one right way to do this. You'll want to develop your own personal style, but to develop your personal style, you'll have to try it several different ways. Now, interviewing is a skill just like anything else. And in particular, it's a skill a lot like playing an instrument for music. There's an old joke that says, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And of course, the answer is practice, practice, practice. You'll also want to do the same thing with interviewing. This is a skill just like anything else, and the more you practice, the better you'll get at it. In fact, even though in this course we're asking you only to do 2 interviews for your user needs assessment, if you can, you might want to try to do as many interviews as you possibly can, just so that you get better and better at the interviewing process itself. Again, you want to maintain a conversational tone throughout the interview, and you want to do the interview while keeping your overarching question in mind. Again, if you adopt a curious attitude, then you'll find that a lot of the logical suggestions that I'm giving are things that will naturally fall into place because the curiosity will override everything else. And finally, if you read the module handouts, there are extra links and tips for how to conduct a good interview. Interviewing is, on the one hand, very simple to understand as a concept, but it can be very challenging to master. So I recommend doing as much of it as you can. In previous videos, we looked at how observation is part of the interview process for user needs assessment. And in particular, in the interview protocol, we talked about what kinds of questions and tasks you should pose in the observation itself. Particularly, we talked about the Think Aloud protocol, where you ask the participant to talk about what they're actually doing and thinking as they go through a task. And we also talked about the different kinds of observation questions that you'll want to ask. Now, that might mean that you're ready to do the observation, but actually, even before we get into observations of the tasks, I want to suggest that observation actually starts even before the interview itself. So for example, if you're going to interview somebody about their experience at the fruit section of the grocery store, you want to make sure that you understand what the grocery store layout overall looks like and how the person seems to fit in. Or if you're looking at a situation where people are trying out different products online that people might be using at the office, you want to consider the office environment as well. So for example, here are 4 different images of people's offices, and you can see how they're very different and what they tell you a little bit about what kind of culture the office has and how that might impact your user needs assessment. So here's one image. You can see in this office that it's very clutter-free. And the interesting thing to note is that there seem to be 2 chairs arranged right in front of the person's desk, which suggests that a lot of this person's work involves interacting with clients or customers. And so that's something that you would want to understand in a user needs assessment. Here's another office. This one is not quite as clutter-free as the previous one, but they do seem to care about their overall visual look. There are posters that seem to be well aligned on the wall. The other thing to notice about this particular office is that people work very close to each other in not quite a cubicle situation, but where 4 people seem to be working in close proximity. And that immediately tells you, for example, that designs that, for example, might make a lot of sound or feedback that requires audio might be something that you would want to consider very seriously before providing it. Let me ask you to think about what's actually taking place in this office. So you probably noticed right away that there are 3 laptops here. I'm not really sure how this person uses the 3 laptops, but if I were interviewing them, I would be very curious to see how they go back and forth between the 3 laptops and whether they make use of all 3 equally or whether they stick primarily to one, as that could really influence how you think about product design. And then finally, here's an interesting office. You can see it's full of clutter. There's a lot of mess. It's not even clear how this person gets any kind of work done, but presumably they do. And understanding how they do it and what they really need to get their work done is something that would be important to understand in any kind of user needs assessment. So those are the kinds of things that you'd want to understand even before you begin the observation process itself, the formal observation process. Now, observation will typically look a little bit more like this, where you're looking over the shoulder of somebody as they use a product or service, and you'll be asking them to go along with what, again, we call the think aloud protocol, where you ask people to actually perform relevant tasks and then tell you what they're doing and thinking as they go about working those tasks. Now, this is actually somewhat awkward at first, and people may not be used to it. Some people are actually very good at it and almost instinctively know what to do. Other people take a little bit more prompting. And one of the things that you'll want to do for the latter category of interview participant is to encourage them to talk aloud by asking them very brief questions so that their answers will be the kind of things that they would say in a think aloud protocol. So you might ask them, "What are you doing now?" Or "What are you thinking about when you do that?" These are the kinds of questions that if you ask frequently and often at the beginning, over time the interview participant will get used to it and they'll start volunteering information as they go along. The other thing to note about observations is that even if you do record them, you're not going to catch a lot of the interesting details. So you'll definitely want to take good notes. The other thing to think about is what kind of things to pay attention to. Personally, I feel that in any kind of observation context for a user needs assessment, what you're most looking for are the unexpected things that you would not normally expect people to do when they're using a given product or service. So for example, you'll want to look for situations in which there are pauses. Maybe the person is confused, or maybe they're thinking about something, maybe they're stuck. Another thing is to look at missteps or potential detours that people might be taking. Sometimes those detours will be intentional. So for example, you might imagine somebody going through the Amazon checkout process where when it gets to the point where they enter potentially a promotion code, a lot of people know that these promotion codes exist online somewhere else, and so they'll open up another browser window, search online for these promo codes, and then go back to the main Amazon website. All of these are situations where the user is doing something that's a little bit unexpected for the actual product designer or the service designer. And so you definitely want to pay attention because these are the places where the user needs really emerge. Finally, you want to make sure that you are asking questions throughout the process, especially if you don't understand why somebody is doing something. So if they seem to take a pause and hesitate before moving on, you might want to ask, "All right, what are you thinking right now? Why is it that you're hesitating, or why are you pausing?" These are good questions to ask so that you understand exactly what it is that the person is thinking. Otherwise, observations are very similar to interviews, and the same kind of tips that you would follow in an interview still apply. You want to make sure that you maintain a conversational tone, keep the interview participant at ease. You also want to make sure that for yourself, you're keeping the overarching question in mind, because in the end, the goal of the observation is also to answer parts of the overarching question. If you can, you want to maintain a certain kind of curious attitude, because in the end, the more curious you are about the situation, the more you'll learn. And again, just like with interviews, practicing the observation process itself is really, really important. In this course, we ask you to observe at least 2 different interview participants. But in real life, if you're doing this over and over and over again, you'll definitely want to practice as much times as you can so that you can get a hang of this, the way it feels to actually observe people, to put interview participants at ease during the observation process, and so on. Finally, I refer you to the module handouts and the suggested readings in there because they also give you advice on how to conduct a good observation. Coming up, we'll be talking about how to extract data from the interviews and from the observation itself. The following is a brief example of someone using the Think Aloud protocol during an observation session. In this clip, the participant has been asked to schedule a trip from Detroit to Atlanta on a travel website called Hipmunk. We'll play a few seconds to see how the Think Aloud protocol should sound, and later I'll come in to point out some things you should notice as the observer.
All right, so I'm gonna look up Hipmunk because I've never heard of it, and I assume it would just be the first thing that pops up. So from Detroit, round trip, I fly from, DTW to Atlanta, and the dates January 16th through 19th. I guess that would be the following year.
Mm-hmm.
So far, so good. This participant is very good about thinking aloud. You get good insight into what she's trying to accomplish and what she's thinking about as she performs subtasks.
And then I kind of just see what pops up. And sometimes it forces me to make those selections, like this will. Okay. So,
Two things to notice right here. First, you might have observed here that even though she entered January dates, the page has reverted to the original default dates in March and April. Definitely worth taking notes about. Second, you might have noticed that the participant does a slight scroll down and back up. It's not clear exactly why she does this, and you could either ask right away or you could wait to see if she does it again.
checking out Expedia and Southwest. Okay, Hipmunk UX test at Gmail.
Notice anything in the last few seconds? Here's a case where the web page opens up new pages, but the participant keeps going back to the original. In fact, it feels a little bit annoying just observing it. Maybe what's called a pop-under window would be better here.
Okay, so Hipmunk is still loading. Okay,
No, there was another slight scroll. It's not clear why the participant does this. It could be fidgeting, it could be checking to see if the web page has fully loaded, it could be wanting to see what's below the visible area. In some of these cases, the issue is with the browser, in others, it's with the website. In any case, it seems worth asking the participant to understand why she does it.
so it seems like the lowest price came up top. There's a few sort options, which is funny, agony. So the lowest price, $3.38, flies Friday, 10 a.m., so the times are pretty decent.
Well, that's it for this clip. An observation could go on like this for a while. In any case, you can see how the Think Aloud protocol works. A few comments about this example. The interviewer didn't do much other than grunt a few times for encouragement, but it's perfectly okay to intervene and ask questions. Why did you click on this instead of that? What are you thinking about as you make your choice? Etc. Also, while this participant was very good with the Think Aloud protocol, not everyone will be. People who are less verbal may need frequent encouragement to think aloud. Once you've conducted the interview and observation, you'll now have a whole bunch of notes and hopefully some audio recordings. Now, in some sense, you can think of the audio recordings and the notes as your raw data. But from that raw data, we'll need to make some sense of it for analysis, and that's a process that I call data extraction. Basically, the idea is to take your raw notes and the audio and then turn it into little bits of bite-sized information that you can use for analysis. This process is something that people call generating affinity notes, and that's partly because the affinity notes will eventually become part of an affinity wall. Basically, what you want to do is, as soon as possible after the interview, hopefully within a couple of days, you want to review all of your notes in detail and actually listen through the audio recording so that you can write down these affinity notes. An affinity note is basically just a sticky note, something that looks like this, on which you write down a code for the user that you were interviewing, as well as a statement or a question. And these statements should come from your notes or from the audio recording in a way that they're basically extracting different bits of information that are relevant for your overarching question. You want to include on a sticky note, again, just one idea at a time, either factual statements, these should be complete sentences. They could be participant quotations where one of the interview participants said something interesting or relevant. They could be observations that you've made, again, as full sentences. Or they could be interpretations that you've thought about of any of the above. Another thing to think about sometimes is to add questions where you may have a question that emerged from your interview that you haven't yet answered. That can also go on a sticky note. The tips with respect to writing these affinity notes are that you should make sure that every note is understandable on its own. It should be a standalone sentence or a question. You want to be as concrete as possible, but also concise so that it's not a whole lot of text on any given sticky note. And then you want to have about 1 affinity note per minute of interview. So for a 1-hour interview, you'd have about 60 affinity notes. Now, in theory, that's the case, but in practice, you'll often find that some cases, some interviews are not as revelatory as others. You might only have, say, 40 sticky notes, or you might have as many as 80. But I would say anything less than 30, for example, for 1 hour of interview is too little, and anything over 100 suggests that you might be making them too granular and more detailed than you need. I mentioned earlier that you'll want to add interpretations to your affinity notes, and these are things that you might have realized as you were taking notes, as you were conducting the interview, or even as you were generating other sticky notes. So if you notice that there are repeating themes, you might want to write that down and say, here's a repeating theme. People seem to get very frustrated when they enter the final stage of a certain process on a website. Or contradictions or conflicts that you've noticed. You can also note key findings that you may have found that may not be visible in any one of the given affinity notes that are from your interview participants or from your observations, but which summarize something overall. You also want to note things like root issues that you might have noticed as you were observing, and anything else that might be ultimately be relevant, but which isn't necessarily in one of your audio recordings or in the notes that you've taken. The other thing to think about is what kind of quotes to include from your interview participants. Good quotes are those which are unexpected because they say something that you really didn't expect, or which in some sense represent many other users' ideas of a particular situation. So going back to the example of a checkout process at Amazon, you might have noticed that everybody seems to get stuck on the promo code section. If that happens, then a user who's made a quote about that particular issue might be something that you want to include. Now, this module is probably the most intensive in terms of the assignments because you'll have to conduct interviews as well as extract these individual affinity notes. The interviews and observations, you want to remember to take at least 2 sets of interviews, each which will take about an hour. And if you take notes and do the audio recordings, you should find that you can easily generate about 100 affinity notes from those 2 interviews. What I'd like you to do for the assignment is to, first of all, take 20 of the notes that you think are most interesting or most representative of your interviews, where you choose out of those 20, 5 should be factual statements, 5 should be observations or interpretations that you've made, 5 should be quotations from one of the users, and the rest of the 5 can be anything that you like. And these will be the ones that will be submitted for peer review, because otherwise it's impractical to assume that somebody else is going to look over all 100 or so of the notes that you've created. More of the details of the assignment will be in the module handout, and I suggest you take a look at that. And let me again emphasize that this module probably has the most intensive workload within this course. Again, you're going to be conducting interviews that might take between 2 or 3 hours total, and then the generation of the affinity notes can be quite time-consuming, and so they'll often take about double the time that you took to do the interview itself. So possible amount of work for this module itself would be about 8 hours. In the next section, we'll talk about how to analyze this data that you've created as affinity notes. The topic for this video is analyzing qualitative data. And before we get into the specifics of how we're going to do that with our affinity notes, I want to talk a little bit about analyzing qualitative data in the abstract. So to start off, let's consider this brain teaser. Can you memorize all these items? And let me just give you a few seconds to take a look and see if you can. Basically, what I'd like you to memorize is the different shapes, how many of each there are, and how many of each color. Now, if you're anything like me, this is a daunting task. It would probably take you at least a few minutes, if not closer to an hour, to really memorize all these things. But I'm going to suggest that there's an easy way for you to look at this so that it's much easier to memorize the different shapes and colors that are available. The first thing you might want to do, and it's possibly a strategy you thought about, is to cluster them by shape. And that's what I'm going to do right now. Let's put all of these circles on the left, the squares in the middle, and the triangles on the right side. Already you can see that there's some order that was brought to the previous chaos. But this is still not particularly convenient. One thing you'll notice if you look at it this way is that there are really only 4 colors. So what if we also sort by color? Now you'll see some interesting patterns. So for example, you'll notice on the bottom that there seem to be 3 of each shape in purple. Another thing that you'll notice is that there are 3 discs on the top left that are in red, and then there are 4 squares in the middle, and then 5 blue triangles, which suggests that as these colors go from red, green to blue, they start with 3, and then 4, and then 5. And then finally, if you look at the remaining ones, you'll notice that for each shape, there's always 1 each of the remaining colors. Now, this is still a pretty complex setup, but my guess is that you can remember all of this just based on the description that we just went through. Whereas, if you had to remember all of them in this way, it's very difficult to do. So here I'm going to suggest that this is really the secret to all good qualitative analysis. And it's also the secret to intelligence. So I'm going to suggest that this is a bonus lesson that you're getting, separate from all of the interview, observation, and analysis issues that we'll be talking about. Basically, the world is full of information, but it's so full of information that you can't possibly remember it all. One trick is, just like we did with the shapes, is to cluster, sort, find patterns, and relate things to each other so that you can actually condense all of that vast amount of information. And if you're good at condensing, it also means that you're getting a little bit closer to understanding, and understanding is intelligence. So in the next video, we'll be talking about how to do this specifically with the affinity notes that you've created from your interviews and observations. And that's something that we call the affinity wall, where we'll take a whole bunch of post-it notes and try to make some sense of it. Affinity walls are one way to do qualitative data analysis. Here's a time-lapse video of people constructing an affinity wall. And you can see over time how there are different phases. Initially, the affinity notes seem to be scattered all over the place chaotically, but over time, they become more and more structured. Eventually, you'll end up with something that looks a little bit more like this, where, as you can see, a bunch of affinity notes, the yellow ones, are grouped under individual blue notes in this case. And then towards the top, you can see that the blue notes themselves are clustered and relabeled with pink and yellow and green notes. So this is the overall structure that we'll be chasing for. This particular affinity wall is actually just one section of a much larger affinity wall that a particular group used to analyze a certain kind of user needs assessment. Now I'm going to do a demonstration of an affinity wall. So what you see behind me are 15 affinity notes. You can see each one is labeled by the user code. In some cases, there's an indication that says that it is an observation made by the researcher. And then in other cases, you'll see quotes around some of the content, which suggests that it's the user quote that's actually on the affinity note. Anyway, what we're going to do now is start moving them around, creating clusters so we can get a sense for what these actual individual bits of data actually mean. So for example, initially it's important in an affinity wall to just start moving things around. You don't have to get too attached to any of the clusters that you create. For example, I noticed that in this one it says burnt toast this morning, and there's another point here that says just this morning I burnt myself grabbing the toast after it was done. So it seems like there's a common theme here that's about burning toast or burning oneself. Let's just put these together and see how that goes. Okay, what else do we have in common? Let's see, here's one that's about the knob not being consistent about how long it toasts. Someone put the setting on low, so I had to toast it twice. So these seem related in that they're both about instances where the toast was not toasted all the way, or it's hard to get the right amount of toast. What else do we have? Broad bread that was too tall for the toaster. That seems like it belongs in its own cluster. Let's bring it over here. You two kept looking into the toaster to see if the bread was toasted. This is another one which has to do with the bread not being toasted, so we can put it over here, not having a good sense for how well it's toasted. After it popped, the top part of the bread wasn't toasted. That seems related to the bread being too tall, so we'll use that over here. Next, it's hard to get that perfect golden brown color. This is really a statement about wanting a certain kind of toast, and I think it's a little bit different from what we have. So I'm going to start a new cluster right over here. I used to set it on max and push cancel when I thought it was done. Another one that's probably related to these about the perfect toast. He flipped the bread upside down to toast the end that wasn't toasted. This seems to be another one that's about bread that was too tall. So let's put that over here. You three likes toast to be slightly crunchy but not burnt. I'm going to suggest that that's, again, a question of good toast, so we can put that here. There's no breakfast like scrambled eggs and good toast. Definitely over here. YouTube, participant pressed lever up so that it was easier to take the toast out. That's interesting. That seems like it's about toast that's actually the bread being too small. So this is bread being too big. We could put it here for now, see what happens. We have 2 more that we can put into piles. Sometimes I have to use a fork to get the toast out. That seems again to be about bread that is too short for the toaster, so it seems related over here. Has smaller pieces of bread that don't pop out when toasting is done. Again, that's definitely over here. So far we have a few different clusters. This is a cluster about bread not being very difficult to toast just right. Here's one about bread sizes being different, with some over here being about bread being too small, bread being too large. Here is, these are statements about just getting the perfect kind of bread. And let's take a look at these. Just this morning, I burnt myself grabbing the toast after it was done. And burnt toast this morning because she left it in too long. So I would say this second comment is closer to this cluster. So I'm going to put it over here. And then I burnt myself grabbing the toast after it was done. That's not necessarily a good fit with anything else. So let's just leave it in its own space. Now, what I want to suggest is that we can further divide this one up into 2 chunks. One about bread being too small and one about bread being too large. So let's move these over here. I'll take this and just move the cluster. And you can see as I'm doing this that it's really not that important where the clusters are at the beginning or how big they are. You just want to bring similar affinity notes together. And so that's what I'm going to do right now. Like this. Now, what's important after you create these clusters and you're reasonably happy with them is to create summary descriptions that in some sense encapsulate all of the information that's within each cluster. So for example, this one, these are all statements about it being very difficult to get just the right level of burning for the toast. And so we're going to take a different color sticky note and put it on top, and I've already prepared these. So let me see what we have over here. And I'm going to use pink as a different color. It's not easy to know exactly when the toast is ready, and the knobs themselves are not reliable. Okay, over here we have a situation where the breads are too tall. So that can definitely happen. And so let's put this label over here. Bread height can be too tall for the toaster. This is exactly the opposite situation where the bread height can be too small for the toaster. And then finally, we have a cluster that seems to be about people really enjoying good toast. Okay, and here, this is a slightly different problem. We can definitely create its own category, but it might be left on its own at the end. Now let's take a look and see if there's any more additional clustering we can do. It's not exactly easy to know when the toast is ready. Knobs aren't reliable. Bread height can be too tall or too small. People really like good toast. I would say these two are in the same category. So I'm going to move them over by themselves. Let's flip these. And the height being too small is definitely about the same issue, which is that the bread comes in different sizes, but the toasted lever height is fixed. So that's one problem. And again, you can see how this label captures all of the information below it. People really like good toast. It's not easy to know exactly when the toast is ready. We could merge these. That's one possibility. It might be that we have a statement like this. I don't think it's necessary, but you could have something like this. And so this is a relatively small affinity wall, but at this point it is mostly completed. And what you can see is that each of the little bits of data has been put into separate clusters. Each of those clusters has a new description that is a summary of what's in that cluster. And if you look at, as you go higher, you have more and more abstracted analysis of what's contained in each of the pieces of data. And one thing you'll notice is that once you have these abstracted bits of information, you can actually think about potential solutions that might be offered. So for example, the fact that the bread comes in different sizes suggests that you might want to have a lever where you can adjust for the size of the bread that you put in. Another is that there's no easy feedback for the user to get good heat control. That might suggest maybe transparent sides so that you can see just how brown the toast is, or maybe there should be some kind of electronic thermometer where you can see how long the toast has been in there and for at what temperature. So these are all different kinds of possibilities. And what's nice about this method of qualitative analysis is that you can really use this for any kind of data and keep clustering until you get high-level analysis like this. So that concludes the affinity wall demonstration. Some guidelines to think about when you're constructing your affinity wall. First of all, when you're starting out, you really want to do things relatively quickly. There's no one right way to construct an affinity wall out of the affinity nodes that you have. So don't get too attached to the clusters that you're creating. You want to kind of move nodes around. Anytime you see two nodes that seem to have a relationship, you want to put them together and then keep adding to that cluster. Another thing you want to do is create clusters that are roughly 3 to 7 nodes in size, so that if you ever have a cluster that's too small with only 2 nodes, you might want to see if you can merge it with another cluster or add other nodes to it. Or if you have more than 7 nodes in a cluster, you might want to consider breaking them up. Maybe there's more than one theme in there. The other thing with the affinity wall is that whenever you have a cluster that's kind of stable and finalized, you'll want to summarize the contents of that cluster and all of the affinity nodes that are created in it with a sentence about that cluster. This summary is one of the tricky parts of the affinity wall, and it basically should be a sentence that makes sense on its own and which balances kind of the abstraction and the generalization that you've come up with for that cluster, but also precision, so that you're not just making very vague statements that don't tell you much. This is a little bit tricky, and over time you'll find that there's an art to it as well, but it really just requires practice, and you'll find that when you go through the analysis process, the more precise the affinity wall summaries are, the better your analysis will be as you go higher in the abstraction. Over time, you'll then take these affinity wall summaries and then cluster them together so that you have clusters of clusters, and so on, all the way up to a certain point where, beyond a certain point, you might find that there's nothing insightful you can gain by merging different clusters. But the goal is to get to a point where you have a handful of clusters, each of which highlights a particular issue with respect to your questions. In the affinity wall assignment, which is really one of my favorite assignments in this kind of work, is you want to complete an affinity wall using all of the affinity nodes that you have from your last assignment. You'll submit a photo of the completed wall, and then I'd like you to choose 2 of the higher level nodes that have something to do with user needs assessment. And they might suggest a change to a product or service. They might suggest a new feature. In any case, they'll tell you something else about the product or service that you might not have known before, or which the people who created the product or service wouldn't have known before. I'd like you to write and submit a 1 to 2 page report about those 2 specific clusters. You should, of course, include an overview of your overall mini project, and then a summary of your 2 higher level findings, along with all of the detailed evidence that provide evidence for those higher level findings. What that really means is that you'll want to take the individual affinity nodes and somehow incorporate them into the description of that cluster. Please also see the more detailed assignment notes in the handouts, and otherwise, I'd like you to have fun, because in many ways, constructing the affinity wall is one of the most fun parts of doing a user needs assessment. Now that you've learned one particular way of conducting qualitative research, which involves interviews, observations, and affinity walls, I'd like to talk a little bit about the larger context of different kinds of qualitative research, so you understand the particular method that you learned is actually one of many, many different ways in which you can conduct qualitative research. So as I mentioned early on in the course, this course does not cover a whole range of methodologies that are sometimes used in user needs assessments, whether they are the creation of personas for different subsets of users, or log analysis in which you might do an analysis of the data that's collected by a product, There are also focus groups. You can run workshops. You might want to run A/B tests where you experiment with different kinds of features and so on. All of these are different ways to uncover user needs, none of which we have talked about in great detail in this course. However, you might want to refer to some of the other courses in the UX MicroMasters to learn some of these other techniques. Qualitative research, as I've mentioned, is not so much a single methodology as much as it is a whole grab bag of methodologies in which you deal with non-numerical data, often interact directly with people and with their working context, and get a lot of richness and detail. So let me suggest that what we've learned in terms of interviews, observations, and affinity walls is actually very closely related to some other kinds of methodologies. And I want to make sure that you understand that what you've learned is similar to some other techniques so that you can say, if somebody asks you, do you have any experience with user-centered design or user-centered research, you can actually say, yes, I at least have tried one particular method of qualitative research. The kind of qualitative research that we learned in this course is sometimes called ethnographic research because it's related in some ways to the ethnographic methodology that's used by anthropologists. Of course, what we do is much, much lighter than what professional ethnographers do because they will often tend to spend a year or two in the field really observing and interacting with people that they're studying. The methodology is also called contextual inquiry sometimes. There is an entire science of what's called contextual design, in which the idea is to understand the larger context in which a product or service is used as a way to gain insights into it. And the methodology that we've learned in this course takes elements from contextual inquiry. Affinity walls on their own are sometimes also called affinity diagrams. And then in some communities, particularly the entrepreneurial community, they're often called the KJ method, named because the affinity walls were originally invented by a man named Jiro Kawakita. It's called the KJ method, not the JK method, because in Japanese you often say the family name first. But this man was, again, an anthropologist who did a lot of work in Nepal. And what he wanted to understand was how to take all of the data he had amassed over months of ethnography and put it together in a way that they could analyze it so that they could provide interventions for the Nepalese communities that he worked with that would be to their benefit. Interestingly, he thought he was coming up with a methodology that was different from kind of Western analytical thought, but in the end, we found that it's just as useful for the kind of qualitative research that we would do in any context. And finally, of course, affinity walls are one way to do qualitative data analysis. So hopefully you've gotten a sense that the techniques that you've learned, while only a subset of the larger kinds of techniques available to people who do qualitative research, you've learned a really powerful methodology that can apply in a whole range of contexts. User needs assessments themselves are often considered a part of user-centered design, human-centered design, ethnographic design, empathic design, contextual design, UX design, and UX research. Now, in this course, we haven't focused so much on the design component, but most of these forms of design that you see on the screen are exactly those in which the design is preceded by a qualitative research phase, often involving interviews, observations, and some kind of data analysis. I also want to mention that even though the techniques that you learned are relatively few in number, they have very broad applicability. So for example, in my own research, I've used them to study how rural farmers in India interact with their mobile phones, how different groups in Uganda might interact with a new digital device. There are some cases where I've studied how people take home videos and what they do with them, as well as how in a corporate office setting, they might take videos shot in the office and put them together for training materials. So that's just in terms of user needs assessment and product design. But again, qualitative research can be applicable to even wider range of different kinds of research. You can use it for anthropological or sociological research, and you can use it for market research and understanding customers in a whole range of contexts. Let's recap what we've gone through in this course. You might remember that we opened with asking questions about vending machines. At this point, since you've learned a little bit about interviews, observations, and data analysis, you should be pretty comfortable saying yes if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I'd like to design the next generation of vending machine. Can you help me figure out what kind of features to add to it? We've talked a lot about interviews, starting with the interview protocol, which helps you prepare for different kinds of interviews, as well as what a semi-structured interview should feel like. You want to make sure that you're adopting a conversational tone and that you keep your eye on the overarching question that you're trying to answer with any given interview participant. We've also discussed observations in which people go through what's called a think aloud protocol, where the interview participant will actually verbally express what they are doing or thinking as they use a product or service. Again, you'll be focused on an overarching question, and you'll ask the participant to undergo a number of tasks which are relevant to your question. We also discussed affinity walls, where you start with affinity notes that are basically little bits of data extracted from your interviews and observations, and then clustered and sorted in such a way that they hierarchically increasingly generate more and more generalized insights into the problem that you're interested in. And finally, we discussed how qualitative research is really not so much rocket science, but involves a lot of practice so that you can really get into the groove of how to put these ideas into practice. Again, the old joke about Carnegie Hall applies. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? You have to practice, practice, practice. Qualitative research is just like any kind of performance art or athletic activity in which, even though the rules are very simple, the principles are relatively easy to understand, but you really have to practice before you can become very good at it. So congratulations on completing the course on understanding user needs. I hope you learned a lot in the process, and thank you so much for taking the time to go through all of these videos.